This is my review to The Beatles Get Back Episode 1, now streaming on Disney+. So, the background to this, there's a lot of information out there already, and I'm not going to repeat it except to give the briefest summary, which is, in 1969, the Beatles agreed that they would perform a comeback concert, because they quit touring in 1966. And they decided that it would be a good thing to do to perform a concert again without actually returning to touring. But they didn't just agree to do that, they agreed to film them rehearsing, and even though they hadn't actually finished writing the songs, and crucially as well, there was a time limit because they only had a few weeks because Ringo was due to start making a movie, and they basically put themselves in a very difficult situation without being very well planned, and it caused them problems, shall we say. But I won't really go into that. I'll go into the stuff that really stood out for me. First of all, they were filmed, and there was about, in the end, nearly 60 hours of footage, most of which has never seen the light of day. A film was edited together in 1970 and called Let It Be. That film, it's not something that the Beatles liked very much. They associated it with their breaking up, and it portrayed what was being filmed in a negative light, and Paul McCartney in particular wasn't keen on having it re-released, so what's happened is this new edit from the original footage has been produced instead. Contrary to some of the reviews, the footage does indeed look like it was shot on 16mm, which it was. They haven't managed to clean it up, and technically the restoration process hasn't made it look like it was 35mm. It does look like 16, and the image is quite soft a lot of the time, but I haven't seen side-by-side comparison of what the footage looked like before it was restored, so I've no way of judging how good a job they did at improving the visual quality of the footage. Peter Jackson has done a great job of editing this. What he's decided to do is just tell the story in chronological order on a day-by-day basis. So he shows literally a calendar and zooms in on the day, and the image of the scene appears, and he's telling it in that fashion. And there are some nice and inventive sequences. There's a great one where we see the future Linda McCartney taking photographs of the band as they're playing, and then the actual photo that she took is displayed. So obviously Paul must have had these photographs, and he's managed to look them out, and he's given them to Peter Jackson for him to insert in the movie. That was a nice touch. There were other nice touches as well where he's done these montages of them performing. For example, they suggest perhaps playing rock and roll music, their cover of the Chuck Berry song, and there's a compilation of them playing it, and it also includes footage of them playing that in the past in their concerts from 1966. So that was all very good. Most importantly then, the people themselves, and this is very much a people-focused documentary. So what are my first impressions? My first impressions were that the Beatles come across as maybe a little bit spoiled, a little bit pampered. They have assistants at their beck and call, and if they want something, then they get it. They get it handed to them on a plate, which is fair enough. I mean, that's what it's like being a celebrity, and I thought that was interesting. And you see one of the characters in the film is Mal Evans, who was the road manager and general assistant, and you see things like there's a great sequence where they play Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which is something I didn't expect to say, because it is a song that it's one of the most disliked Beatles songs of all time, and I certainly dislike it. When I listen to Abbey Road, I skip that track typically because it's cringeworthy, but that original performance that we see, and with Mal Evans is hitting an anvil with a hammer, and it's actually fun. I enjoyed watching that. But something else I thought about, and I'll get to George in a minute, but I got the impression from this that the sessions really weren't as bad from an outsider's perspective as the Beatles themselves would come to think they were. I mean, if this is bad, if this is their idea of a bad day at work, they should try working in an office, filling in forms on a computer all day. They don't know how lucky they are. First of all, I'll talk about Paul. Paul, how does he come across? Well, he comes across rather like an extroverted decider. He is the assumed leader of the group at this particular point in time, even though it was John who started the band and was the leader in the early days. Paul seems to have taken over here. What's interesting is you can see he's the only one who's fully enthusiastic about what's going on, and the others seem to be just going along with it and aren't as enthusiastic about this entire project. But you've got to say, I mean, he's trying. Here's the thing, he is really trying to make something out of this, and like he says, he says to the others, I'm not getting any support, which seems to be fair. There's a great sequence in here where it seems like you're actually watching him write the song Get Back from scratch. I don't know how true that is, if he had something prepared, but he just is by himself and he's strumming away on his bass guitar and starts, it seems, making this song up on the spot. And it doesn't sound like Get Back exactly to begin with, but he sort of, the shape of it starts coming out and he kind of whittles it down or sculpts the song as we know it out of this initial vague vibe thing that he was working on, and that was very interesting to see. So the next person I want to talk about is John, and it's been well documented, it's no secret that at this time in his life he was addicted to heroin, and you can see him being affected by this to various degrees depending on the day. At first, the first few days it doesn't seem too bad, in fact it's hardly noticeable, but as the days went on and the sessions became more stressful, he seems to turn up at Twickenham Film Studios already intoxicated by the drug, he and Yoko, and I'll be talking about Yoko a bit later on too. He does look sort of in a daze at times, but when he's not, he is quite lucid. He still speaks and he still puts his opinion across. The story is that because he was numbed from his drug use, he was very quiet and he didn't make much of a contribution, and that wound George Harrison up. George felt like he had been abandoned by John. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know. It doesn't really look like that's the case quite so much. There are other rumours as well that he was quite catty or pointed and would make sarcastic jokes and barbs, particularly at Paul's expense, and we don't actually see a lot of that here. The next person I want to talk about is George. And I've got to say, George doesn't come across very well in this episode. And it's funny because I've seen his son, Danny Harrison, on the red carpet at the premiere for this. And he said that he didn't give any notes to Peter Jackson. So he didn't ask Peter Jackson to edit any of the footage of his father out, and nor did he ask him to portray George in any particular way, which is great. It's very honest to do that. But George, in this episode, he comes across as withdrawn and sulky and in a bad mood and frustrated. And he's frustrated because you can see him looking at John and Paul and thinking, this is just the John and Paul show again, which is what he's become tired of, and he's wanting to make more of a contribution to the music, and he feels like they're not letting him do that, they're not involving him as much. He also appears to be nursing a bit of an inferiority complex, or at least, if not a complex, then feelings of inferiority at this time. He explains why he isn't as good a guitarist as Eric Clapton, or Clapton can do something which is to play throughout a song in a kind of improvisational manner and keep that up, whereas George would prefer to play preset licks and solos when he plays the guitar, and he's sort of feeling a bit self-conscious, and it's almost as if he feels like his level of proficiency and his way of playing is likely to get a little bit exposed in this process, because he's being asked to, basically, they don't have a lot of time, so he is being asked to come up with these guitar parts pretty quickly, and he's not getting a lot of time to develop his ideas or to go away and think about these things and come back, and that seems to make him a little bit apprehensive and feel a little bit like he is not particularly suited to this process. Last but not least of the Beatles is Ringo. Now, I feel sorry for Ringo a little bit because he gets a bad rap. People attack him or think of him as an easy target because he is, as they see it, the weak link in the Beatles, and I think that's unfair. He is someone who, again, perhaps comes across, I don't know if he comes across as DE or not, but I think what he does, people sort of attack him and say that he plays only a supporting role, but that's a bit like saying that the foundations of a house only play a supporting role. It's like, try having it without that and see how well you get on. And Ringo, he looks a little bit tired. I think they were all a bit tired because they used to going to bed late and getting up late, but because they were shooting a film, they had to readjust to 9 to 5 hours, which was difficult for them. But Ringo, one of the things about him is that he wasn't an ego player. He didn't try to show off on the drums or even draw attention to himself. He just tried to play what he thought was the best, most fitting beat and the best accompaniment to the rest of the music and to the song itself. And we see him doing this. Now, the next character in the film that I want to talk about is the original director of the footage, Michael Lindsay Hogg. And what's funny about him is that he's trying to big up this project, but I think it's like he is trying to do it for his own sake. He keeps talking about a Roman amphitheatre in Libya that he wants them to travel to and perform the concert there and do all different things, like they could perform it as the sun comes up and they can do it in front of an audience who've never heard Western music before, like an audience of Libyans who could be carrying torches and all this sort of stuff. It seems more like he wants that on his CV more than he's doing it because he wants the Beatles to make a good film, and it's too grandiose. It doesn't work, it would take too long. There isn't really time to get them there, because if they do that, then it eats away at their rehearsal time and they need to rehearse more, and they're already in a film studio, so why not just build a set there? And that was one of the alternative suggestions. And finally, the last character I want to talk about today is Yoko. And what's interesting here is she doesn't speak, or they've edited out her speech from the whole thing, it seems. What we do see footage of her chatting with Linda, but you don't actually hear the vocals. That's a bit of footage that's interspersed while the Beatles are playing. And generally, she's just sat next to John and often just reading a book. I saw a review in The Guardian that said that this ought to improve people's estimation of Yoko, the fact that she was able to sit through all this. But there was a nice bit at the end where it's known that Yoko joins in with the Beatles and they start making some avant-garde music and creating feedback with their instruments, while Yoko wails in her banshee vocal style. And that was quite fun to see, especially it was a surprise because I thought it was almost as if Yoko was being edited out of this, and maybe she wanted to be, because maybe she realised this is about the Beatles and not her. Something one could argue that wasn't her attitude at the time. So those are the people, and it'll be interesting to see when I review episode 2 if I have any updates on the people and how they've behaved and how they evolved over the course of the sessions and the course of the documentary itself. So, to summarise this, I would say the major issue critics have been debating is this too long? Has Peter Jackson done his usual thing and give too much of a good thing? People have compared it to The Hobbit, saying how he's taken quite a small book and then made 3 long movies out of it. And here you have something that happened over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, and he's giving us hours and hours. First, this part itself is 157 minutes long. Part 2, 174 minutes long. So my defense of this is I, as a fan, wasn't actually bored, but I'm the sort of person this is really catering for because I'm a Beatles fan and I'm interested in people's personalities. So from this point of view, I would say that it was definitely worth the footage that was provided. Also, it's the last chance to see this footage, and it's this is the last unseen footage and unheard material that the Beatles produced. After this, there really isn't anything left in the archives that can be shown as new, so it's worthwhile at this point to just get as much of it out there, I think. Plus, because I guess this is it's a historical document, and there are some interesting bits, like there was a conversation between Paul and Northern Song's music publisher, Dick James. Now, he's someone that Beatles fans might have heard of, and it's interesting interesting to see him and Paul discussing business. It's got really not a lot to do with the concert rehearsals, but it was worth putting in there as a side note. And there are quite a lot of side notes here, because I can understand why Peter Jackson has decided to make it this long, because there are little threads and themes and, as the Beatles are arguing, little points of contention, and they're quite subtle. And if you don't put these threads in place or put a pebble down as you're going through the forest, you won't keep track of these. And it actually, by making it longer and including all these things, it actually gives the viewer more to hold on to. Some critics have said that it is directionless, but I disagree. I think the direction is there, it's subtle, and it's because Jackson has included these scenes and has included this much of it that there is this subtle thread running through the whole thing that actually gives you something to be interested in, apart from just the music. And so I definitely, after just watching the first episode, I'm pleased that it was that long actually. And my final thought before I watch episode 2 is the Beatles playing is very good. It's funny that even just a run through, it's hard to believe sometimes, you're watching them doing a run through of a song the other musicians haven't played before yet, and it still sounds good. And this is what Paul McCartney was getting at. He was saying that when they played together, they played well, and he wanted to get back to that because he thought that was a key strength and something that united them, and you certainly get that. So hopefully episode 2 should be just as enjoyable, and I'm looking forward to watching that.